Hi, everyone. Welcome to another webinar by NFCP. As you know, I'm Louis Vargas, the founder, and quick intro for NFCP. We're here for you. We're here for the community. So everything we do is for you, trying to help enlighten you, train you up, benchmark, all that good stuff. And you see, I'm joined by John Smith from MoFo, Morrison Forrester, and we're going to try something new today. We're going to try what I'm hopefully will be a new trend, kind of a brunch chat or informal chat with different people in the industry. Bit of informal chat just to kind of talk about them, how they've gotten into the industry, and any pearls of wisdom they would like to share. But before we get into it, I just want to highlight the fact that whatever we discuss today is not legal advice. It's just for informational purposes only. So please, if you have any specific issues or questions, please talk to your internal group legal, your internal compliance officers, all that good stuff. All right. So without further delay, I'm sure most of you already know who John Smith is. But just to kick us off, John, give us a brief intro on yourself, your background, and how did you end up in sanctions and the national security practice?
Sure. Good morning, Louis. It's really good to be here with you on this episode. I've got my coffee, so promising to have a
Yes.
nice coffee chat with you. My name's John Smith. I'm a partner and co-chair of the Morrison Forrester National Security Practice. Morrison Forrester is a global law firm, and we go by the name or the acronym MoFo. I was in the national security space for 20 years in the public sector, 5 years at the U.S. Justice Department, then 3 years at the United Nations and one of the expert panels on the counterterrorism. And then I moved for 11 years at OFAC, the U.S. Treasury Department sanctions agency. I started as the number 3, then became the deputy director, and then became the director for the last several years. To answer the question about how I got into this interesting field. It was really before there was a thing called national security law. To date myself, the dinosaur that I am, I started work at the Justice Department in 1999, and this little known agency, OFAC, was one of my clients that I defended in just a few small matters. And honestly, I couldn't believe when I first understood of the agency, heard of the agency, just the massive power to freeze assets that I understood that it had. And then September 11th changed, and it changed the world. It certainly changed the trajectory of my career. Instead of just being a little slice of the work I did at the Justice Department, it became everything I did at the Justice Department. Is the US and the global community moved to sanctions more as an answer to counterterrorism at the start, but then to increasingly all of the world's global major problems seem now to be met with the use of sanctions. So I kind of fell into this career rather than having planned it with some careful precision decades ago. So I got lucky.
Thanks for sharing, John. And yeah, I feel like a lot of us kind of just happen into sanctions. It's something that, we maybe get a shot doing something else, and then it's kind of sanctions adjacent. And then we're like, oh, this is pretty interesting. I want to dig into it deeper. So it's cool to hear that was also part of your origin story.
Absolutely. I mean, I feel like for anybody like me who likes to read, when I turn to the newspaper or get online, I want to follow world events. I want to follow the crises in our communities and our nations around the world. And I always increasingly focus on those areas. And I thought, okay, this is the world for me to be involved in trying to resolve some of the global conflicts of our time. Even to date myself further, in college, was South African apartheid sanctions.
Yeah.
And I remember being a protester, protesting that the US should impose sanctions like that. And then I found myself years later thinking, that's now my career.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I was, in New York City during September 11th, and I had a family friend who unfortunately passed away in the attack. But also remember feeling quite helpless and not having a hand in helping rebuild, New York City, doing anything that I felt was really kind of above and beyond trying to help with the healing process. I've always, as a kid, I wanted to be a police officer, but I just, I don't have the heart to see people injured or in tough situations. So, I felt that falling into this kind of career was my way of kind of giving back and trying to fight the good fight. So I agree with you 100%. Um, And just to give people also a little personal note for me. So I started working in sanctions back in 2013, and I saw John's name in different documents and stuff like that. And then I had the fortunate opportunity to work with one of your former colleagues, Andrew Valoria, who's also a collaborator with NFCP. And
One of my favorite people.
he always talked about his time at OFAC, and it was super interesting. So we worked with each other both in New York and also currently in Copenhagen. And I remember a few years ago, you were coming to town, and you all invited me saying, "Hey, my friend John is coming to town. Come have a drink with us." And I'm like, "John who?" He's like, "John Smith." I was like, "The John Smith from OFAC?" Okay. And I remember getting super nervous. I'm like, is it okay if I meet him? I don't want to be a third wheel. He's like, "Nah, he's super cool. Don't worry." And then I remember that evening he couldn't get a hold of you because he was running late. And I knew somebody who you were actually with. And I reached out to him and I'm like, "By any chance, are you with Mr. Smith?" And he was like, "Yeah, okay, we're here." So we met up with you and you were like, "Why are you calling me Mr. Smith? What's wrong with you?"
I was even thinking that now. Why are you calling me Mr. Smith?
Yeah, so I quickly learned how down to earth you are. And, subsequently we've, met a lot of times for conversations and drinks. You've been to our offices for giving, briefings. So yeah, just wanted to kind of share that kind of personal note of how we first met and how nervous I was to finally meet you. But how
You never told me that story before. I didn't know that. I remember how we met and I remember the good times since, but now I'm getting a little bit more of the origin stories.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so moving on to the next question. If you can share, obviously, what were some of the most challenging sanctions enforcement cases that you worked on during your time at OFAC?
Challenging has a couple different meanings, and I'm going to give you a couple of the different ones. Challenge just how legally complex and burdensome and time consuming cases can be. And those are probably what are called the major bank enforcement cases, the wire stripping cases. Those were beasts because you would deal with tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of pages of documents or attachments or other things that we would have to go through.
Mhm.
It was also groundbreaking in ways that we hadn't anticipated. But we were really surprised when those cases started, and we found that not only were banks outside the US knowingly using the US financial system using the US dollar to do business with sanctioned jurisdictions and sanctioned parties. I think what really surprised us was seeing the internal debates at many of the banks where the compliance and legal teams were saying, this may be violations of US law. We shouldn't be doing this. This is really concerning. And then the business teams would say, let's just move ahead.
Mhm.
And banks did that for years and years. So it's not it wasn't a practice that was just a surprise within the banks. They knew in many of those cases that what they were doing likely violated US law. So I think those were some of the most challenging in terms of complex. I think challenging also has a different meaning where, we each push our boundaries. And in some of the ways, the smaller OFAC enforcement cases that can be industry lessons can be challenging to make sure that you come to the right resolution, that you don't seek a higher penalty just for a higher penalty's sake, but you put out what can be a valuable industry lesson. And those were challenging to make sure that we came to the right result.
Yeah, as you mentioned, like, those were you guys were trailblazers, right? Because, it's not like they were, I mean, obviously there's historical, cases of how to deal with embargoes and sanctions and stuff like that. But the way, you guys were looking at it, the way that sanctions were being implemented were new. So you had to kind of, like you said, really be careful on how you were addressing these risks. How are you setting the new precedent, right? Because, I mean, I'm not a lawyer by trade, but I know, from what I hear, a lot of it is kind of looking at past cases to then form your decision for the current case. And a lot of things you worked on during that time, there was no, kind of, we're looking at it with fresh eyes. And that reminds me, of kind of how I got started in sanctions. We were always taught error on the side of caution. If you're not sure, flag it as then it could be a match, even if, it's not crystal clear. but we just want to be sure, be extra cautious, because if we then decide, well, we don't have enough, evidence and let it go, we don't have enough explainability to say if OFAC comes knocking at a door or a regulator comes knocking at a door and says, why did you let this happen? We can't just say, well, because we weren't sure, right? So it's that fine line of juggling um, how to effectively apply these regulations and the law, and then how to, make these decisions in gray areas.
Yeah, absolutely. I like your line when you said you're not a lawyer, but it's the beautiful world of sanctions. The beauty of it is that we can come from all different backgrounds and we all have a role to play. At OFAC, we had the combination of lawyers, financial crime experts, industry experts who understood complex financial products. We had investigators, we had intelligence analysts. You've got somebody there who's supporting you. We've got
Yeah.
you've got it all, and it's very important in terms of, coming to the right resolution. And I feel like that if you think of, financial institutions, they take every different type of expertise, and most of our companies do as well. You need the business and you need the fin crime compliance and legal and investigators, the FIUs, all of us together to try to get us in the right direction.
Exactly. I couldn't agree with you more. It's not just in the sanctions community, but across the fin crime community. There's a lot of, fine line that runs through each kind of area, shared red flags. So it's very important to work together to come to a good goal. And like I said, this is a brunch session, so you can see it live behind me. Family's back home. My son's playing behind me. So it's true to form. We're doing this a bit less formal.
It's quieter here because I'm in the Rhineland of Germany and we have such a beautiful day. My family is all outside. I can be quieter inside now.
And you have a nice office too. I'm blurring the background because behind me is not so nice, even though there are books. But yeah, wow, beautiful view. It's quite gray here today in Copenhagen, so not great, but at least it's not raining.
Take that.
Yes, so thank you for sharing about your experience at OFAC. OFAC, I know it's interesting times and super challenging. Since you've left OFAC, I think things have continued to kind of morph into new ways of doing sanctions and also integrating, export controls and trade compliance. So that seems to be blending more into the sanctions world. But given your current role with MoFo, I'm just curious, what are the common compliance challenges that your clients are coming to you asking you for advice on when it comes to sanctions regulations and even export control?
I think it's a combination, and I assume it's the same for you at a big bank, is you've got something new every day, which keeps us fresh, keeps us on our toes. But I think it's a combination of the big and the small. The big in terms of thinking about the big picture. What's going to happen to Russia sanctions? Are we going to have divergence between the US and Europe? What are we going to do with respect to the increasing US focus on China? Is Europe going to be caught in the middle? What does that mean for our customers and clients? But then when I say the small, I don't mean small in terms of unimportant, but I mean just the daily work and compliance, the due diligence, customer, the screening, all of the work that we do on a daily basis. While the oxygen often gets taken away by the big issues, where you're most likely to get in trouble is day to day. You just screwed up something that you've done 1,000 times or more. Somebody wasn't paying attention, or somebody saw some yellow and red flags and decided to let something go on. That's where you're most likely to see an enforcement case. And so I think it's, for what I'm seeing, is making sure that you're focused on the big issues and notifying your institution of some of the broader changes that may come, but while maintaining excellence in your day-to-day compliance program.
Yeah, so true. Actually, I'm glad you brought up the whole screening thing because, I feel like sometimes that's the forgotten thing. Like you said, there's the big ticket items, like more advisory stuff, but screening the day-to-day gets to be a bit mundane. We know false positive rates are super high. So and I think that lends itself to it. But yeah, just to jump into that real quickly, knowing that the screening, there's what we have today in screening, it's not great is not really efficient. We're looking at ways to implement technology to maybe help us kind of be a bit more laser focused and sharp. Yeah, I'm just curious kind of to hear your thoughts on the future of sanction screening. Do you think that it's becoming more of a must have but a useless task? Do you feel like, there's ways to refine it to make it more, as I said, laser focused? Yeah, just curious to hear your views on that.
Well, I think it depends on who you're talking to and the size and sophistication
Mhm.
the client that uses screening. We often talk about screening when we talk and how they do it, but I think about screening also in dealing with companies and corporate compliance programs where you continue to see problems where either companies don't screen or they just screen SDNs but
Mm.
not looking for ownership or control,
Right.
and then realize, wait, we've also got to screen for like Iran and
Mm.
Cuba and Syria and North Korea. And then, OFAC enforcement actions, even over the past year, have talked about, wait, we screened at the beginning, but then we continue dealing with a customer for months and years after that customers, or a number of the customers got sanctioned in the
Mhm.
meantime. What I think about corporate compliance programs, the screening needs to become more routinized, more effective, but not overkill.
Right.
And then when I think about the globally sophisticated financial institutions, and I think that's probably where your question came, I do think we're going to see advances in technology, AI, and other use tools that will help make it more effective. I don't think government's ever going to accept the plea from financial institutions, hey, screening's not that effective, so let us do less of it,
Right.
because it does catch a significant number. It's just when you look at the rates, infinitesimally small.
Right.
It's still an important thing to do, and I think we just need to find more ways to be efficient about it. And as we do, and as the industry does, I think communicating those new ways, new tools
Mm.
to regulators so that they become comfortable and we have a good industry approach.
I think you raised a good point. From the US perspective, screening, obviously there's no law that requires screening, but the other regulations and laws kind of say screening is your best help in getting this done. And in the US, starting my career in the US, it was drilled into me from the beginning. We screened everything, inter-country, right? The US, we screen everything abroad. Obviously there's a lot more risk with cross-border, but we still look domestically. And that was a big shock to me when I moved abroad to the Nordics, where Finland currently is the only country that has domestic screening. The rest of the Nordics do not implement that, only cross-border. My understanding is that that's being kind of reviewed now, to see if that still makes sense. There's some countries like Sweden that the local FSA seem surprised that domestic screening is not a real thing or a common thing. But yeah, I think based on your point, I think a lot more jurisdictions will start taking this view similar to the United States, where they will look domestically, and because there are also potential threats there too, but it has to be, of course, the risk-based approach, right? So we'll see how it
There's
gets implemented.
no one size fits all
Yeah,
risk-based approach, and what works in one jurisdiction may not work in another jurisdiction, and
exactly.
that's fine. That's good. That's why we should be, kind of adapting our compliance programs and our compliance standards for our own areas of risk.
Right. So just I know we kind of started getting into kind of screening and the technology part, but I want to also now kind of backtrack now to something you were talking about before, where during the Biden administration, we saw a lot of cooperation and synergies made between the different major, sanctions regulators, let's just call them. They're not regulators, but maybe regimes is a better word. So you saw a lot of synergy between the US, UK, and the EU, and it increased effectiveness, right? Because now we didn't have to worry about, who's saying what and where it applied. But I'm just curious now with the current US administration, do you see that type of synergy continuing, or do you anticipate more divergence?
Or divergence. I think it's clear the I was a career civil servant through 4 administrations, 2 Democrat, 2 Republican, and I was in OFAC as the director for nearly the first 18 months of the first Trump administration. And it was clear that the MO, the method of operation, was really to make decisions as the United States and then communicate those decisions that this is what we're doing. We, in many things, we expect you to follow. And it was really carrying a big stick as a country. And I think you're seeing that more and more now. The US will impose its views and communicate them to the rest of the world. And in many cases now, there's a new tool not called sanctions, but called tariffs. But whatever they're called,
Right.
they can be used to threaten, to penalize. Even close allies of the United States have found themselves um, uh, facing U.S. scrutiny, maybe not some with sanctions and tariff threats, like Colombia in the first weeks of the administration. And given that you're sitting in Denmark, certainly it's surprising to find ourselves having debates or listening debates in the United States, some of our closest historic allies like Denmark and like Canada and others. So it's certainly an odd time, but this is clearly going to be a time of divergence between the US, Europe, and the rest of the world. I think the International Criminal Court sanctions are probably a really good example.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised by that answer. I was hoping maybe for some more positivity, but yeah, it does look like the
How about I'm positive there will be divergence?
yeah, it's true. I mean, that all signs are pointing to that. The US are just looking inward and they expect, like you said, everybody to just fall in line. And yeah, it's unfortunate that, I guess we're used to this being more targeted toward who US feels their enemies are, but now it's also targeting who their historical friends have been. So we'll see how that plays out.
When you say positivity, I want to take a step back too. It's easy to take the simple approach that the US will come to decisions and try to impose them. That will be the case, but they're also really hardworking diplomats working across borders, those who are former diplomats and those who are not, who are still trying to work across borders. The career folks within governments continue to do that. And I fully believe that there will be continued cooperation. Our values are still, as upsetting this as this may be for Europeans to hear these days, the values between Europe and the United States are still probably as close to shared values as you can get from jurisdictions so far apart.
And kind of to piggyback on your comments there, and I'm just curious with the U.S. So, their secondary sanctions. There's always been this threat of extraterritorial risk. How do you, or maybe not so direct, but what advice would you give to companies navigating this complexity where they're not sure if they would have to be weary of these secondary sanctions?
I think these are legal and reputational and risk issues to take. Um, just after leaving the government and joining MoFo 7 years ago, some of my earliest conversations were about the original round of Russia sanctions and the CAATSA statute that made them instituted the secondary sanctions threat. And I remember being surprised as a former OFAC official, the level of risk appetite from some that I would say your risk really, really phenomenally low here because technically, yes, there would be a risk of secondary sanctions under the statute and under the regulations that OFAC put out. But OFAC put out factors similar, and none of those factors apply here, or very few. And so I think your risks are really low. And I think companies need to evaluate the actual risks of secondary sanctions against their own reputations and what they feel like they need to do.
Right. Yeah, good point. It's maybe not so much of a legal question, even though that plays a big part, but it's also the reputational risk, right? You don't want to be seeing the company facilitating, these types of trades or transactions because as we all know, even when for personal reasons, it's first impressions are big. It takes long to build a good impression and reputation, but you could lose it in a second with the wrong interpretation or the wrong view by somebody. So a lot of companies budget for enforcement actions and legal actions, but they can never really fully understand the impact of reputational risk, because sometimes that could be a lot more damaging.
Yeah, absolutely. And I look at it in legal risk and reputation. And the legal and reputational both have risk factors.
Yeah.
And sometimes the legal risk isn't so great, but the reputation is going to be greater. And so you make an excellent point about both of those being important.
Awesome. Two more questions and then you're off the hot seat, John. So if you had a chance, um, like if you could change kind of one aspect of current sanctions policy, what do you think it would be and why?
Maybe I'm going to give two answers.
Sure.
The first is just I hate divergence. I wish that the Trump administration would decide, and it's 3 months in, so who
Mhm.
knows? But I hope that the Trump administration will increasingly see the value of of a unified front. Multilateral sanctions have historically been far more effective than unilateral ones. Look at the US-Cuba sanctions in terms of how they're viewed around the world versus really the impact of the united front against Iran or against Russia, against their malign activities. So maybe that's one. The second one, though, is wonkier, but I think it's probably most important for industry. It's frustrating to be on the inside at OFAC and simply not have enough resources for the less sexy areas of the agency. Everybody wants new sanctions targets and everybody wants new enforcement cases, but the licensing officers
Mhm.
are dealing with sometimes thousands or tens of thousands of applications, and those budgets don't tend to get plussed up. And here in Europe, and looking at how the EU does sanctions, there are some jurisdictions, some countries that don't really have licensing agencies to be able to jump on things. And there are some EU sanctions that are imposed that don't include licensing grounds. That frustrates me because you'll never anticipate future needs, and it frustrates me within jurisdictions. You don't have to need the size of OFAC if you're a smaller of the European members of the EU to have a body assigned to handle this. And I wish that there was more done on that front.
Super interesting. And thank you for sharing, John. So, yeah, last question I have for you today. What would you say to someone looking to build a career in sanctions compliance? What advice would you give them? Maybe what to study up, maybe certifications to look into, somebody either changing careers or even somebody fresh out of college. But what advice would you have for them?
I would say it's a great career because sadly, as long as there's not peace on earth, we're likely going to be fully employed. And it's a field where you can actually make a difference. And you don't go in, if you're a sanctions compliance professional, you don't go into your office bored every day. You're constantly challenged. You're constantly on your feet. So if that sounds like the type of career that you want, then I would say study toward that. There's so many different areas. As I said, you can study the law, you can study kind of national security issues, you can study foreign policy, foreign affairs, you can do political science, you can do any other type of work, and graduate with your degree, follow through with the kind of the career by reaching out to the openings that exist at a number of banks and other companies for compliance officials. Get certified, as you said. There are a number of certifications out there that I think can really help you become better and sharper at your field and get involved in the industry. Like your organization and a number of others, it's helpful to be in community with like-minded folks who are interested in preventing financial crime. I think becoming a part of this community can be a really lifelong, rewarding experience.
Awesome, John. So with that, you're off the hot seat. Thanks again for your time this morning and providing, a closer look into you and your experience in the field. It's much appreciated. Whoever views this recording that have any questions for me or for John, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll filter those questions over to him and try to get an answer for you. Can't promise, but again, NFCP, we're here to help the community. So if you have any suggestions, any follow-up questions, we're always here to help. So with that, John, again, much appreciated your time. Great seeing you and hope to hang out with you again soon. And yeah, any parting thoughts?
Just thank you to you for putting this together, for having an entertaining coffee chat in the morning and taking the time to have the conversation and try to build a community of like-minded professionals there. So thank you and enjoy talking to you.
Thanks, John. See you soon. Take care,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.